I find the lives of people that came before me fascinating, because they've gone through so many different events and they have such a different perspective than I do. I didn't live through World War I or World War II, you know, and those were really interesting times in our country. It's something that you can read about in a book or, you know, watch on the Discovery Channel, but it's different to hear, you know, what someone who actually lived through those periods, like what their day-to-day life was like, or what their experience in war, if they were a soldier, what that was like. And the changes in technology alone that my grandmother has lived through just amazes me. When I think, when she was born, like the car was barely an item yet, and now, you know, it's just in the year 2003, it's a whole different world. You know, she's lived through, and probably that period of time has been like the period of time of most change in the entire span of time. She'll be 94, and we don't know how much longer she'll be with us, so it would have been something really concrete, you know, something like a living example of who she is. I just get teary-eyed thinking about my grandmother, because she's the last of her generation, and you know, I used to ask her questions all the time, and she would tell me stories, and I can't do that anymore. You know, she wouldn't. I don't think she'd be capable of relating the same stories as she was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It's a real loss not to have it directly from her anymore.
I guess for me right now, I'm starting to learn or become more aware of the value of stories and history and what my mother went through and what my grandmother went through, and I think it would give me a sense of maybe security, even just knowing their story. My grandmother recently passed away, and I regret that I didn't take the time and put forth the effort to have her on film, because she has so many stories to tell. And she grew up in the coal mines in West Virginia, and now that she's gone, a lot of her stories are gone. And I feel a sense of loss about that. And she had a real unique, fun personality. And so what I'm considering at this point is my sister, who has some of those personality traits that are real fun and silly and quirky, with a great sense of humor. I would like to get her on film, and maybe in that way I could capture some of my grandmother's essence. And also, my sister has a story to tell too.
Well, you know, my experience was with my dad's tape, and I just felt like it was really wonderful. There were a lot of stories that I hadn't heard before. Many stories, of course, that I had, but it's wonderful to have a permanent record of them, and especially with his voice and his face attached to them, because the stories are really special coming from him.
You know, the story was just so beautiful, and it was really my dad, you know. It was just the perfect way to get that history down and to get a look at his face while he spoke it and his voice. I just feel like I'm excited about the idea of his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren being able to see who he was and how he spoke. So much of my dad is wrapped up in his presence, in his, you know, as a minister, and just as a person, his gentle spirit just shows through in the film.
Well, a lot of children never meet their grandparents, or they're too young when their grandparents pass on, and a lot of them never meet their great-grandparents. So it would be a way for a grandparent or a great-grandparent to talk directly to a great-grandchild or a great-great-grandchild, or even further down, so that you can know a little bit about who your ancestors are and where you came from and what their story is.
You know, I can tell my children about my grandfather, who died well before my children were born, but you know, the stories just aren't the same, and they don't have the same sort of connection that they'd be able to have now for their children in relation to their grandfather, to have you know, an actual recording, and to see the person, and to make that connection with the stories of who was behind them, and what this person looked like and talked like and acted like. So I think it's a great benefit for those reasons.
I would give anything to have that kind of a film of my grandfather, who was quite a character, and probably the opposite of my father, in that he was very, you know, excited and always ran around and did things, and he was had this great presence. And so, you know, I knew him until I was 12, and then he passed away, but for my, you know, my children to get a sense of who that person was in their lives, I see flashes of him in them, and it would just be so neat to be able to say, hey, look, here, you know, here's this 45 minutes, but man, you really get a sense of a person in that time. And for me, that's the really valuable thing about this film. I mean, I cry. I've watched it 3 times, and I cry every time, because he's so there.
It did seem like it would be an opportunity to tell some of the stories that I enjoy telling without having to write them down. Several times I'd tried writing stories down, and I'd also tried taping stories. But it seemed like it might be an easier way to put things down. And I agree with you, everybody's got stories, and most of us like to tell our stories, and I think the opportunity to put those on tape for other people to watch is just fun.